Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Practical Ransomware Protections for Higher Education. This event is brought to you in partnership with Nutanix. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. We've got a great event lined up for you. Before we get started, just a few things that you should know about the event. First off, my name is David Davis and I'm serving as the moderator on this webinar. We want this to be an educational event. We know that higher education institutions out there are constantly being challenged with ransomware threats and ransomware attacks and infections. And so this event is here to help you solve your challenges around security and ransomware. And so we encourage your questions. You can use the questions tab. It's there in your audience console. I can call your attention to it that way. Of course, we appreciate all the greetings and hello messages from around the world and across the United States, but we also want your questions specifically on today's topic. We'll be doing a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so keep your questions coming in throughout the webinar. We also have a couple of handouts there I want to call your attention to, specifically a link to the Practical Ransomware Protections for Higher Education landing page. It's there that you can find additional information on today's topic, and we'll be talking about upcoming events on this topic later in the presentation. And then finally, one lucky attendee on the live event today will be winning a brand new pair of AirPods Pro Apple headphones. So make sure you stay tuned for that prize drawing at the end of the presentation. Those are provided by Actual Tech Media, and you can find the prize terms and conditions there in the handouts tab. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to today's expert presenters. They are Mr. Harsha Kodikela, Product and Solutions Marketing Manager at Nutanix, and Mr. Neil Ashworth, Network and Security Solutions Architect, also at Nutanix. Harsha and Neil, it's great to have you on the event today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, David.
All right, well, before I hand it off, awesome. Thanks for being on. Before I hand it off to Harsha, I want to first ask everyone out there in the audience this poll question. The poll question is there on your screen. The question is, what's your biggest cybersecurity challenge? We have a very high number of higher education institutes on the webinar today. I know many of you are challenged around cybersecurity and in multiple different areas, multiple vectors of attack happening. And so I'm curious to know, this is a multi-select question. You can select more than one answer here. Which of these areas do you consider your greatest challenge or, just even your top challenge? Answers are, a variety of devices and licensing that has to be supported, resources and expertise challenges, and finally, complications with changing student body and classes. And so I'll share the results of this poll with you. You can kind of see how you stack up with your peers on the webinar today. All right, we got a lot of responses. Thank you, everyone. Let me go ahead and share the results of this poll. And it looks like the overwhelming greatest challenge here was resource and expertise challenges, just finding the right staff, followed by a variety of devices and licensing that needs to be supported. Thank you for your feedback on that. So now I'm excited to hand it off to Harsha. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming over to listen to us and learn about how we can protect higher education from ransomware, right? So that was an interesting poll. That was very insightful to see your responses on it. And that's correct, right? When we talk to different customers that we have at Nutanix in education industry, resource and expertise challenges is typically one of the topmost challenge that we always hear. The reason because this, pre-COVID, the education body or institutions where the IT departments especially were not equipped or not even expected to have a huge cybersecurity portfolio team, right? Because that wasn't the go-to thing. But now, since everything is moving to digital environment, cybersecurity has become a huge thing, and that's putting a resource constraint and as well as expertise challenges, right? Because resource constraint, especially also because there's top line challenges in institutions with registrations at a historically low for students, and on top of it, like you need a lot of investments for overcome investing for IT modernization. So that was a good poll, and thanks for responding to that. So in this seminar, what we're going to cover, we're going to cover about how can we protect ourselves, our education institutions against ransomware. But before I jump into those topics, right, like I wanted to kind of briefly give you a context of how Nutanix views this market, and how when we develop our solutions for this market, what do we recognize are the top priorities within this education institutions. So there are four key priorities that we see in education institutions. One is transforming academics. Essentially that's the mission for any institutions, right? Like how can we transform academics so that we create leaders for our future? So that has been the mission statement for all our learning environments, right? In addition to that, securing students and data, that's another key focus area, and improving student services and modernizing IT. Right, improving student services as in increasing the experiential learning aspect of it, so that the learning becomes more engaging for the students. So that has these four have been the four core areas of priorities in the institutions. But with increasing in digital education, right? Since last March, when many of the states, have gone into stay-at-home mandates or any other restrictions, many institutions went into online education, distance learning, or even now when they're opening up, they're in hybrid or blended learning model, right? So with that said, with that model, securing students and data has taken a very high priority. Actually, recently I was in a CIO roundtable, and they were mentioning that typical IT issues like cybersecurity doesn't reach the president of the university level discussions, but with all the PR and the news going on of ransomware and about losing data, losing student data and all that, this has taken a whole different meaning and whole different priority, highest priority, uh, all the way to the president of the university level, right? So securing, how do we secure student data and the information learning environment? So with that said, so how does Nutanix provide solutions for this, for cybersecurity? So in here, if the key IP priority is cybersecurity, because of all the things I mentioned before, as in the education itself is moving to distance learning, and there's a lot of threats facing this distance learning or digital learning, like breach of data, denial service, ransomware, a lot of things, and also because of the variety of devices, of the edge devices that you need to support, and the changing student body, and also the expertise required, you're looking for something simple solutions. So as a general framework, there are three kind of things that could be done in addition to all the security posture that you already have. These three security practices that I've noted here in the bottom of the slide is, endpoint protection system, that is basically protecting the endpoints. And universities, higher education, have tons of endpoints with the students as well as university campuses spread out. Right? Big universities are when universities have multiple campus and students are like widely spread out. So how do we protect those systems? The second thing is identity and access management. So these actually protect the infrastructure. And finally, how do you protect the data itself? So for all these things, Nutanix provides broadly, three solutions that directly address these needs. One is a foundation solution, that the AOS and Prism, that helps with virtualization, native virtualization and encryption. And the second thing is Nutanix Flow, or that helps with network and microsegmentation needs. And the third one is actually protecting your data itself with our files and objects solution, right? In this presentation, we're going to go much more detail into our Nutanix Flow solution, and in general how it addresses our the protection needed for ransomware. So Neil is going to go much more detail into it, but I wanted to give you a broader picture of our overall solution portfolio on how we can build a foundation, a secure infrastructure foundation, and on top of it, how can you improve your security posture, and in addition to that, how can you also protect your files and objects. And finally, after that, is there's a lot of universities out here. You should see some big universities like Texas A&M, Alabama A&M, and Arizona State universities, which rely on Nutanix software to help them out for the infrastructure needs, right? Because Nutanix's solutions are simple, right? Especially in this time where university IT teams are expected to do more with less, right? More with less, and also they need simple solutions that they're able to learn fast and implement it fast, right? So these big universities rely on us for those kind of needs. If you take Texas A&M University, that has multiple campuses around Texas. Not only that, it has one of the largest student staff body in whole of United States, right? So they're relying to provide those student services as well as educational services based on Nutanix infrastructure software. So with that said, let's go now jump into a little bit more of our solution details, and I'll hand it over to Neil from here.
Thanks, Harsha. Hi everybody. I'm Neil Ashworth. I'm an architect at Nutanix. It would be good for us to better understand the anatomy of a ransomware attack. So when it comes to understanding the anatomy of a ransomware attack, I took the processes of a couple of different ransomware variants, a ProLiant variant of ransomware and an Imitet variant of ransomware. There is hundreds, if not thousands, of different variants of ransomware, but they typically follow a similar kill chain process. There's typically an initialization vector. Now, this is how they manage to deploy some type of Trojan within your environment. Sometimes something like Quackbot or Qbot is dropped on as a means to kind of exfiltrate data, perform key logging, capture browsing activity, save cookies, etc. They'll use this information then to try and perform a process of AD enumeration, AD reconnaissance, to try and find those admin level accounts that they can use to perform privilege escalation activities. Ideally then, the issue that we have with crypto spiders is their ability to spread laterally throughout the environment, either using those compromised administrative accounts or some type of batch script to enable things like RDP or NetBIOS and SMP enumeration using MBStat and SMB client. It's at that point then, when they've managed to ascertain the scope of your environment and compromise additional machines, that they would attempt some period of data exfiltration and maybe even defense evasion to maintain access into your environment, doing things like disabling group policy objects in Windows Defender and taking down antivirus or agents that may exist on the console. And they'll do all that prior to the ransomware execution, which is typically some type of downloaded dynamic link library using bits admin and then executing them on the victim machine to encrypt the data. So effectively, we need to put in safeguards at each process in this kill chain to try and impact its ability to execute. Keenly, where we want to pay our attention today is in the prevention of lateral movement throughout your environment. We can, I guess, come to the realization, or at least the acceptance, that a compromise can likely occur, even if we put in a great deal of protections at the endpoint, just because signature-based identification of this type of spurious activity has a low success rate, around 20 or 30%. And so if we can restrict the capacity for an infection to spread throughout the environment, we can, in essence, drastically reduce the means and the time to business resolution to try and get back to normal operations, and therefore the impact of that infection is fairly minimized. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. Let's go to perimeter. Great. So with an ever-increasing adoption of hybrid cloud infrastructure, creating a security perimeter is almost impossible. And a perimeter is really the means by which we've always understood how to apply security at our private data center. But applications themselves have evolved past the limitations and restrictions of the physical private data center. And so the traditional methods of protecting them applications via perimeters is becoming untenable. And it's because the perimeter's really becoming indefinable. If we were to think about it in a different way, policy is really a new perimeter, because you can apply access restrictions and security policy enforcement at a machine level, especially a virtualized machine, or even at a microservices level. And so this new method of achieving security for multi-hybrid cloud environments is more aligned to policy-based protections rather than perimeter-based protections. Coincidentally, it's also in line with concepts that are being driven in zero trust architecture documentation. So today we have an issue where we have a lot of products all trying to gain supremacy against one another with advanced threat identification and malware responses. But the truth is that there's no real one product or solution or strategy by itself that's enough to mitigate this entire threat on its own. And a lot of these tools have evolved into highly complex platforms, which are then resource intensive, as you identified in the poll earlier, and therefore impractical to manage without continuous monitoring and response by either an in-house security team or a contracted security operations center. So to achieve a state where policy-based security is possible, we require, in essence, a secure platform which we can build upon. And when you come to think of it, vendors should be providing their products as hardened as possible out of the box, because this method of providing a platform to a customer, which they then have to go away themselves and harden, can result in system conflicts. It can affect performance. It can possibly lead to risk acceptance or risk avoidance after a period of risk analyses and stuff. And in severe cases, aversion or reticence to perform any hardening whatsoever, which invariably leads to the system compromise. Nutanix believes that vendors ourselves should take that trouble to provide an intrinsically hardened platform capable of self-healing from deviations to a hardened system state. Now, this is a deeper conversation that we don't have time to go into today, but a Nutanix node is hardened out of the box with NIST-aligned STIGs. It keeps alignment with that control framework with an SCMA daemon that runs periodically. But effectively, what we're doing is we're providing a platform or a means by which a customer can isolate workloads, detect potential misconfiguration errors across the multiple cloud environment, and easily be able to provide evidence of their alignment to a security framework to system auditors like PCI, HIPAA, NIST, etc. So we want to be able to provide a means that facilitates an easier method to achieve security compliance, as well as being applicable to hardening against vulnerabilities that exist in the world that we exist in today. There we go. HCI is a naturally strong foundation for cybersecurity practices. If you're not familiar with what we're doing in HCI or how we invented this space, I would encourage you to become slightly more familiar with some of the videos that are available on YouTube and things like that. Effectively, what we did is we removed a great deal of complexity that existed in enterprise data centers by consolidation of a myriad of different technologies into a single unified platform. Similarly, then, these concepts were mirrored in our application of security to that platform. And so when we provide security capabilities to our customers, they have to follow a guideline that we've already established in the establishment of HCI, hyperconverged infrastructure. We're also exceptionally cognizant of the fact that, as you again mentioned in the poll at the beginning of the presentation, that resources are very limited, and none more so than in the space of security. Security engineers, like most others in the IT department are often overworked because of the complexity that's arisen in enterprise data centers. And there's also a fair bit of mystery that surrounds the role of a cybersecurity engineer. Unfortunately, what's ever unknown is typically grouped together, and SecOps people tend to be pulled into lots of meetings, allowing very little time for them to do their day-to-day duties, some of which I've tried to capture on the slide here. Things like firewall and IDS and IPS configuration and monitoring, and maybe even getting involved with network architecture planning and sometimes configuration. The deployment of endpoint protection suites, and plus the configuration and monitoring of those. Being responsible for ensuring that we do things like security updates across all the OSs in extant on the system, and the complexity around performing those updates out of hours. Maybe even getting involved in the data protection policy, the processing, transference, retention, destruction of data that was collected. Obviously, if they're very good at doing data protection policies, they would undoubtedly be involved in the business continuity and disaster recovery strategy planning. Always involved with identity access management controls, including the rolling out of things like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, role-based access control. And then, of course, the providing evidence for the multiple security audits and compliance frameworks that you have to do during the course of a year. Obviously, this list is no means exhaustive, and I've included it for brevity, really, but just as a conversation starter, really, because you can realize then that we actually understand that for us to provide you more tools, more complexity in an environment that already exists as a complex environment doesn't actually help solution the issues that we're facing. The only means by which we can address security in the data center is to provide simplicity and reduction of work in order for people to be able to actually be proactive in this ongoing battle against cybersecurity threats. We've set a little bit of a bleak picture. And to summarize basically what we're trying to do at Nutanix is this concept of invisibility. We began as a company that wanted to make on-prem cloud consumption invisible. We're now in the process of trying to make clouds invisible, hiding the complexity that exists beneath your day-to-day operations. And with that comes this concept of invisible security as well. This is what we do, and by the means of how we do it. So when it comes to simplicity, the ethos of the Nutanix interface is also a security measure. This sheer weight of misconfigurations that can occur in things like public cloud infrastructure exists because people don't really know how to properly leverage that technology. And so we need to provide a means to de-escalate those potential misconfigurations by applying things simply. The deployment, configuration, management of our platform and security tools should be a simple process. Security itself should be intrinsic or built in. Simple operations is one thing, but building in a structure of security across all aspects of the technology is also integral to an invisible system. And so for that end user to be able to benefit from an intrinsically secure architecture, the security has to be ubiquitous. It has to be everywhere across all the products. It has to be integrated without the need for further configuration, installation, or adjustment. And it has to be intelligent by anticipating potential vulnerable vectors and then closing them before they can be exploited. And lastly, especially in modern data centers and across hybrid cloud systems, for us to be truly invisible, we have to leverage autonomy. Security operations is the goal, but setting your desired remediation action and allowing systems to deploy to take the burden of that first response. Typically, customers are using automation and security, are using some type of SOAR, like a security orchestration, automation, and response tool, like Phantom Cyber from Splunk. But invisible security should be able to do things like self-correct from deviations to a set security configuration, which is what a Nutanix platform can do. It should be able to automatically provide insights into lacking compliance alignment. So potentially a report emailed to you on a weekly or daily basis, letting you know what virtual infrastructure components do not meet the guidelines that you may be looking at trying to align to, things like PCI and HIPAA. And the autonomous aspects of applying network security policies dynamically to new virtual machines, which exist as quite ephemeral pieces of technology. If we look at the left side of this slide, this effectively demonstrates the issue that we have with trying to defend against malware as it exists today. It's able to bypass our perimeter firewall and infect our endpoints via some advanced obfuscation techniques, the use of packers, things like that, spread laterally across a broadcast domain, and then eventually elevate privileges, credentials, and then compromise file services, databases. And before you know it, the resolution to this infection is exceptionally difficult and time-consuming, consisting of multiple backups and maybe even long-term backups in some cases, which makes complete resolution actually very difficult to achieve. Ideally, the best solution that we would have is the right side of the picture, where we deploy firewalls everywhere. But that could potentially be costly because firewalls are very expensive and very resource intensive. And so what we've done at Nutanix is try to consider this from a stateful layer 4 firewall delivered in software. And so now, when we have the same process of malware being able to bypass your perimeter firewalls and infect an endpoint, that endpoint can effectively not see anything else within its own broadcast domain, even using layer 2 protocols. It's completely blocked. As far as that machine is aware, it exists as a singular entity in your environment. And this is how we can then restrict the pervasiveness and lateral spread of infections in the Nutanix environment. We could also leverage advanced autonomous orchestration tools that can make API calls and quarantine suspiciously malicious machines. As I mentioned earlier, this is in alignment with zero trust architecture concepts. If you're not familiar with zero trust architecture, there's a NIST special publication out in support of it, the NIST SP 800-207. It's more of a guideline than previous special publications like the 853. And it talks about shifting the challenge response mechanism much closer to the resource being accessed. So they don't explicitly talk about specific technologies in the achievement of this goal. It talks about creating smaller implicit trust zones. And when we look at how we've done things historically, we have a challenge response mechanism and then we allow free reign throughout the environment, which is why Zero Trust was created as a means to address this as a concern. It does mention technologies like micro-segmentation that can help facilitate an easier Zero Trust architected platform, but it would also include things like access management, need to know, and things like that. If you want to know further about how Nutanix and Flow can help with this concept of Zero Trust architecture, we can have more detailed discussions down the road. Now, this is a great slide that helps you identify the potential for reducing the risk experienced in your organization. On the left, we have workloads that are unprotected, and on the right, what type of reduction in attack surface we can expect to see with the imposition of a whitelist protocol, therefore allowing these machines to work within the confines of their application needs, but restricted from speaking to anything else. And as you can see, it's quite a vast reduction, and therefore the attack surface is drastically reduced, and therefore your exposure or the risk at which an advanced persistent threat would consider trying to attack you is reduced because you're not a desirable target. So effectively what we have at Nutanix is a three-tiered approach to providing security, especially from ransomware threats to our customers. It begins with a prevent strategy. This is encompassed with a multitude of different technologies, but utilizing more advanced identity access management frameworks with role-based access control, using our micro-segmentation tool named Nutanix Flow to drastically reduce the scope at which infections can spread throughout the environment. Facilitating an easier method to do system updates that's unimpactful and unobtrusive. Earlier, we mentioned the fact that a security engineer would likely be responsible for deploying security updates and patches to all the OSs in your environment. None more so than the infrastructure that supports those OSs. And reticence to apply those patches because of fear of impacting or interrupting your applications and your environment can lead to these types of vulnerabilities being exploited in those environments. And so we needed to provide a means by which to greatly simplify that process. And so Nutanix has Lifecycle Manager, which can perform one-click uninterrupted updates and patches. It was also encouraged and not mentioned before that if we do get to a point where ransomware execution can occur, it would behoove us to use some type of immutable data backup policy. And so Worm, if you're not familiar, is a write once, read many technology that we can support using data protection policies run on Nutanix platform. A second part of our strategy is to help detect these types of suspicious, malicious activity in your environment. Flow has the capacity to introduce a service chain to add layer 7 capabilities if you wanted to deploy a virtual firewall appliance. That can help in the detection of such activity. We also have advanced features in Prism, which is the management control plane for Nutanix, and automatic responses in the event of X and Y. Please do Z. So that can help in anomaly detection and automation. There's also a robust amount of policies, audits, and event logs that can be exported to your SIEM. And if you're using Nutanix for file services, advanced file analytics engines with new signature-based methods of detecting this type of activity, even the changes of an appendix to a file, such as a doppelpaymer variant of ransomware that changes the appendix to .doppel, for example. Just one of the over 4,000 appendix changes that are already pre-configured in Nutanix file analytics to help prevent the execution of ransomware within your environment. And then finally, a very simple means with which you can recover your data is intrinsically part of a security strategy. With hyperconverged infrastructure, we actually have a unique position to be able to provide data protection and replication policies quite intrinsically and natively in the platform. Using technologies like Leap, if you're going to control both sides of the DR aspect, or Zyleap, which allows you to back up to a cloud which is owned by Nutanix. Now let's just briefly speak about how we actually apply the Nutanix version of microsegmentation. So how do we do it? There are a few components that we leverage. First and foremost, for customers to be able to use microsegmentation with Flow and Nutanix, they have to be an AHV customer. AHV is the native Nutanix hypervisor, stands for Acropolis Hypervisor. And what we've done with that hypervisor is we have adapted the Open vSwitch construct in the hypervisor to include additional bridges in the bridge chain that we can then introduce capabilities like microsegmentation and service insertion. This also means that there are no agents to deploy on your virtual machines or in your environment. It makes it exceptionally lightweight and highly performant. We also use Prism Central, an existing management control plane, in order to start creation of the policies that you would necessarily use to protect your environment. In the example that we can see here, we have a 3-tiered application. This could be anything. For the sake of the conversation today, we'll just call it a WordPress application. So these group of virtual machines would need to be identified in software so we can perform the segmentation capabilities that we want to perform. So we used a metadata construct that we call a category. This category value can then be assigned to a virtual machine. And we can try and think of them as a key value pair. So in this instance, we'll have the group of 9 virtual machines tagged with an application type of WordPress. In order for us to apply very nuanced security policies, it would make sense for us to split that application up into the various tiers needed to support the application. the web tier, the app tier, and the database tier. Once we've done those things and we've created a policy that you can see here that's been created whereby we only want to allow web traffic on ports 80 and 443 into the web tier. If I was to try and SSH into that tier, the packets would be dropped. If I was to try and ping those web virtual machines, those ping packets would also be dropped because they're not explicitly part of the policy that I'm creating. I can then subsequently have the web tier speak to the application tier on port 8890 and the application tier to speak to the database tier on 1521. I can't speak from the web tier to the database tier if I don't put it in the policy. I can't speak from the database tier to any other tier if I don't put it in the policy. And that's how we can create very simple to execute, also very intrinsic, and also dynamic security policies. If, for example, we had to scale the web tier to accommodate seasonality, and now the web tier consists of 6 virtual machines rather than 4, those 2 new virtual machines that were created would inherit the policy based on the fact that they've been appropriately categorized. It also doesn't matter to us where these virtual machines sit physically on a node or logically within a VLAN that you've already created to support your environment, because the packets will be dropped as soon as those packets try to hit the VNIC of that virtual machine supported by our hypervisor. And again, you may have to build this out a little bit. So the types of policies we can create using Flow are numerous. The first of which I briefly mentioned in the slide where we saw the malware infecting machines, and that's a quarantine policy. Quarantine is the most stringent policy we can create in a Nutanix environment. We can also have application policies, as you saw me describe in the last slide, and then we also have the capacity to support virtual desktop infrastructure. If we were to think about perimeter-based security for virtual desktop infrastructure, that is quite costly to scale. There's an emphasis on hardware, and the configuration and ongoing management of it is very complicated. And we've already alluded to that complication can lead to disillusionment, that can lead to avoidance, and then can be a root cause for failure. So if we were to use software-defined microsegmentation for a virtual desktop infrastructure, we can support that level of dynamicism, and we can also tie into things like Active Directory. So we can pull those AD groups and apply AD group-based security based on the person who logs into a virtual machine. So historically, we've seen the use of VLANs being provisioned as a means to protect virtual desktop infrastructure environments. That then creates a broadcast domain which is easily compromisable. If we were to readjust how we would deploy this same architecture, we can integrate with directory services, as I mentioned earlier, and now we can identify, using a WMI log scraper, those access events that occur. And so in this instance, John from HR may log into Windows machine 123, and he would then have applied the HR policy defined to that Windows policy, to that Windows machine 123. Whereas if we had a contractor log into that same Windows 123 machine, he could exist in an entirely different security group. Another method that we can provide is an environmental style policy. Environmental policies are really good for trying to isolate some set of data from another set of data. It may be incumbent upon your compliance framework to keep separate all student data from all corporate data. Well, not corporate, but in terms of, school operations, educational operations, etc. In this instance, you could quite easily tag, using the category value of student, all the virtual machines that support student data, and then the inverse relationship to that would be non-student data, creating those isolationist policies between those two environments, and therefore being able to share the same shared infrastructure, but without the issue of potentially exposing student data to a non-student data environment. This also can be applied if you're using different types of Nutanix technologies, such as a file services technology with Nutanix files. We could use isolation policies or environmental policies created in Flow as a means by which we can prevent the HR file server, for example, or file share from being exposed to the sales file share, for example. Next one again. So that's really a very brief overview of the Nutanix technology. I probably ran through it a little bit fast. There is going to be a hands-on event on the 19th of March, I believe, which you can access using the Practical Ransomware Protections for Higher Education handout link at the right-hand side of the screen. If you'd like to experience flow microsegmentation yourself and walk through the process of activating it and then creating policies to protect virtual machines, you can do so at the link that's provided at the top of the screen here, nutanix.com/oneplatform. You can also test a myriad of different Nutanix technologies using this link. And that wraps everything up for me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation, Neil and Harsha. I really appreciate that. We do have some questions coming in here from the audience, and we'll just leave that link up there to the Nutanix test drive for everyone to check out while we do this Q&A. I want to point out to everyone that that link you see on the screen there is a hyperlink. If you mouse over that, you can click on that. That'll open up a new tab in your web browser or a new window, and you can try out the Nutanix solution for yourself. So let's see, Neil and Harsha, first question that came in, they're asking about, does Flow or Prism provide or support DLP type policies or integration with next-gen firewalls?
So it really depends on the vendor. DLP is more of an agent-based capability that you would put on the endpoint, and we don't typically have integration points for DLP software. However, we do have partnered technologies such as Palo Alto, Juniper, Fortinet, whereby they can virtualize their appliance or work with Nutanix APIs as a physical appliance to provide the layer 7 capabilities that you've come to leverage in your own environments, potentially managed via the Prism console or vice versa. And so there are means of integration, but not across all types of security tools because they may not be applicable to the underlying hardware that supports your apps.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Next question, they're wondering if Nutanix has integrations with on-premises existing SANs or current applications such as third-party vendors and cloud providers like AWS and Azure.
Well, that's quite a big question. So does Nutanix already integrate with existing SAN technologies? No. Nutanix is effectively a replacement for SAN architectures, where it's a consolidation of the virtualization and storage and management control plane and the servers into a single unified form factor. It presents the grouped storage to control of virtual machines as a singular distributed storage fabric. In terms of integration with hyperscalers like AWS, Azure, GCP, yes, we have actually recently launched a capability called Nutanix Clusters, which allows you to launch the Nutanix software on an AWS bare metal instance. We're also simultaneously working that same functionality with Microsoft Azure with a roadmap to support Oracle Cloud and GCP in the near future. So we envision a capacity whereby we can help facilitate that process of giving applications true mobility, where you can deploy applications that need consistent consumption of resources in your own on-premise data center, and then potentially spin up an environment in AWS to test and measure what is necessary to support an application in cloud instances such as AWS. So yeah, there's a great deal of work going on with the hyperscalers, and in terms of existing three-tier architecture, we're more of a replacement technology for that, a private cloud that you can consume in your own data center.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Great answer. Let's see. Next question. This is kind of a multi-parter here. they're saying that, in higher educations, they have grants that align to specific data retention and governance requirements. How does Nutanix align itself to these types of standards? Specifically, they're referring to NIST 8286, integrating cybersecurity and enterprise risk management systems. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's quite a large conversation to have in terms of what I'm seeing, especially in compliance frameworks with data retention. I'm seeing it, I guess, more in CGIS than anything, because body cam footage is exceptionally large, and having to keep that for 30 years can become exceptionally expensive. So we need to get quite clever with how we provision our data protection strategy. My opinion to customers has historically been one of tiering that data and maybe offloading some of the frozen data to an S3 compatible Glacier instance in AWS, for example, which we can provide the tools and capacity to do that with the Nutanix platform. Nutanix also offers varying styles of node. One of the node form factors that we can provide is a heavy storage medium node, for example, that can help with a lot of the data retention policies that you're referring to. Now, in terms of our alignment to a lot of these security standards that you see in different frameworks, I would say that this is probably best a detailed conversation and probably architectural discussion with either myself or someone from my team. But Nutanix is used quite extensively throughout the government DoD space. There's already, as Harsha mentioned earlier, we've already been explored in lots of the SLED space across America and across the world, in fact. So there is yet to be a compliance security requirement that I've seen that we've not met.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
just David, just to add to that, right? So I know where this question is coming from especially urban universities. In order to receive a lot of research grants from DoD or federal government, they need to be compliant on some NIST certifications, as well as in some cases FedRAMP security levels. So we are aware of that, and we do work with some universities. As you've seen in my previous slide, like Texas A&M and Alabama A&M, and also University of Arizona, which work on various federal grants and which need infrastructure that is certified and also FedRAMP, right? So we need to get into detail on case by case basis, as in what portion of the infrastructure or solution they're trying to be certified. But in general, we do have customers that work on federal research grants and use our infrastructure to be certified for that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I absolutely agree. We got to get more details and get deeper into that question there, because it sounds like this could be a great solution. And so let's move on and talk about microsegmentation. I mean, you talked about Nutanix Flow. Why is it that you feel that microsegmentation in a virtual environment is so important when it comes to improving security and preventing ransomware?
Yeah, that's a good question. It literally comes down to the way that malware has evolved over the last 10, 15 years, whereas historically it wasn't expected that malware could spread throughout your environment laterally. And macro segmentation, or the provision of VLANs supported by access control lists and stuff, was typically considered sufficient security. Now, where we exist, where virtual machines are fairly ephemeral and they have an element of mobility to them, we need to apply security at a machine level and prevent the capacity for malware to cascade between user virtual machines. And so the only way to achieve that type of security is with the use of microsegmentation. Now, there are different technologies that offer microsegmentation capabilities. Some may add latency. Some may have to have an agent installed on the virtual machine in order to better understand application workflow and create a map. Some potentially don't support layer 2 isolation protocols, so there has to be a great deal of homework performed by the customer who's looking to deploy microsegmentation capabilities, and to the extent at which they need additional software-defined networking capabilities or not for their own environment.
Excellent. Excellent.
I don't know if Ash has got anything to add to that, maybe. I don't know.
No, I think you covered it. Great. Thanks.
All right. Well, so before we go, I want to just kind of see, what's the next step for any folks out there on the event today who are interested in this? They want to learn more, maybe see it in action. What's the best way to go about doing that?
Okay, great. Yeah, there is a hands-on lab that we're going to host on March 19th, 10 a.m. I'm not sure if that time frame is Pacific time or not, most likely. Oh yeah, all events are Pacific time zone. In order to register for that event, in the handouts, the first link, practical ransomware protections for higher education, if you click view, you're able to then register for this event, and I will walk you through the use of flow microsegmentation and some examples of it in work. There's also, you could, on your own volition, navigate to nutanix.com/one-platform and perform some of the stuff that you'll see me do on the 19th, but yourself and follow along the wizard that's in play. Again, in both of these examples, there's nothing to install. All the actions are performed via the web. We just basically deploy a Nutanix instance in a GCP supported platform. And so we also have a hands-on experience on April 2nd, which again you would have to register for using the links provided.
Excellent. Yeah, those sound like great opportunities. I mean, I know that so many higher education institutes out there are being impacted with these types of security threats and ransomware, and so this Nutanix solution here with flow and microsegmentation sounds like really the ultimate solution for those types of attacks. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I look forward to learning more about this, and I encourage everyone to check out the handouts tab to register for this upcoming demo, and you can see this in action in detail, get all your questions answered. I'm afraid we're running out of time on the event today, but Harsha, Neil, it's been really great learning about this solution. Thank you for your presentation.
No, thank you for having us, David. This has been great.
And
Thanks, David.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Harsha. Thank you, Neil. And thank you to Nutanix for hosting today's event. Visit Nutanix.com and, of course, check out that first link there in your handouts tab to register for upcoming hands-on live demo events around this technology. And before we go, I want to announce the winner of our Apple AirPods Pro giveaway today. That's going to Rodney McCorkle from New Hampshire. Congratulations. We'll reach out to deliver that prize. Thank you, everyone, for joining the event today. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.